I guess it's a good time to get started. First of all, Happy New Year, everybody. And you know, I thought we could, since we don't meet that often, if we can go around and everybody can introduce themselves in case you forgot since the last time. I'm Nancy Waxstein with Fordham University.
I'm Lisa Neary. I'm the General Counsel at IBO.
I'm Phil McCausland, Root College.
Mark Sherwood, Q.
I'm Don Boyd. I left the Rockefeller Institute. I'm in transition.
Jennifer Marsh, CCC.
Ronnie Lowenstein, Independent Budget Office.
And CCC is Citizens Committee for Children, in case people are thinking civilian conservation. Civilian Conservation Corps, right?
About that old.
George.
Yeah. George Sweeting, Deputy Director, IBO.
Arash Farahani, Economist, Public Policy.
Sarah Stransky, I'm the Housing Analyst here at IBO.
Elizabeth Brown, I'm a Supervising Analyst at IBO.
Preston, the Black City Controller's Office.
Conrad Patillo, Economic Development, Budget Analyst.
Doug Turetsky, I'm Chief of Staff and Communications Director at IBO.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. And as you know, our sessions are recorded as per the law. So we need a quorum to approve the minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that has to wait.
So why don't we wait? I know everybody's on tenterhooks, but why don't we wait? So since we last met, obviously there's been a lot of there are a lot of interesting developments in our country and our city. Starting with our city, we have a new director of the City Office of Management and Budget. Most of you know that Dean Foulahan, who had been in that role for the first term of de Blasio's administration, is now the first deputy mayor. And Melanie Hartzog, who some of you know, some of us know, is now the new chief of OMB. She started? Has she started?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's, and then of course there's the tax bill, which I think is probably part of our uncertainty that's looming. So Ronnie, do you want to start with the director's report, and then we can go back to the minutes for those of you concerned?
Okay. Before I say anything else, I want to introduce Conrad, who just introduced himself. He's our newest analyst, and he's a budget analyst for economic development. He comes to IBO from the MTA. Oh. And before
having solved those problems?
Yeah, he's those done.
Maybe leave him. It's called getting away from those.
And before that, the Clinton Foundation, and he has his MBA from Rutgers. Okay, I just wanted to go very quickly because there's a lot on the agenda, and just go back to 3 publications that I previewed in last meeting's director's report. The first one was on Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, and you can hear a whole lot about that from Sarah in a minute. The second concerned the MTA. If you recall, we had received a request from the Brooklyn Borough President. In particular, he was motivated by a total mess of a commute on July 21st when the Q train derailed in Brooklyn. That managed to actually affect almost the entire system. And he came to us asking how much time do commuters lose to subway delays. And turns out it's a lot. We found that the time lost to delays during a typical morning rush during the weekdays had actually risen 45% over the past 5 years, which was just astounding to me. It went from an average of 24,000 hours per day lost in terms of delayed commutes to reach 35. Oh.
Hello, the green one?
But I would go for the green one, yeah. Hello?
Hey, this is Greg Walker.
Hey, Greg.
Okay.
Hi, Greg. Welcome. We just started.
Okay, good.
Great.
Just so you know, the number that I received is for a non-working number, a number that is not in service.
Oh, apologies for that. I'm glad you got through somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was just updating people on work that we did on the MTA, which showed that over the past 5 years, time lost due to delays, had actually risen by 45% over the 5-year period. In terms of just total number of hours, the numbers are huge. It's 24,000 hours per day on average 5 years ago to closer to 35,000 hours per day lost during the rush hour now. Obviously, those numbers look huge, but there were huge numbers of people riding on the subways. In dollar terms, that's, if you value the commuters' time by their wages, you're talking about a little over $1 million a day 5 years ago, and in current terms, a little over $1 million a day, and it's not that much. It sounds like a lot, but it's not. But the figures are in fact understated in a lot of different ways. But the most important way is that they don't take into account, our calculations don't take into account all of the time that all of us always build into our commutes if you actually have to be someplace by 8:30 or whenever.
Such as this morning.
Yeah. So if you have to be at work or a doctor's appointment or happily a show, you have to build in a lot more time than you used to build into your commute in order to make sure you're there. And those numbers would dwarf anything that we found. And then we did the whole exercise again by line. In case you were curious, delays increased on every single line. The smallest increase over the 5 years was actually 24%, and it went up from there. And the biggest losers, the biggest increases were the J and Z line, the C line, and the 7. So that's where where the delays increased most over the period. It was eye-opening. I mean, it of course described what everybody was living with every day, but it was still eye-opening nonetheless. Then the third study I mentioned was educational achievement gaps by race and by gender. And what we did was assemble a cohort of third graders in 2008, New York City Public Schools, and compared achievement on English language and math tests, across that third grade cohort by race and by gender, and then continued to follow those same kids. So they had to be the same kids. They had to progress on a normal progression from one year to the next. They had to remain within the city school system, although they could go from one school to another. So we were able to get not just a read on the achievement gaps for those third graders, we were able to see how those gaps changed over the course of late elementary through middle school. And the patterns vary, and there's no easy way to categorize them, but let me just give you one. Amongst third graders, girls do better in English language arts than boys. And that gap consistently widened as they went through 8th grade. And that was true for every racial category we looked at. So I recommend a look at this. It's not the easiest reading we put out, but it's really good data and has some, I think, well worth reading. Let's put it that way.
Ronnie, what was the number again of the number of students you looked at?
It was every single third grader in 2008, 2009. And that sample was cut to the extent that some of those kids didn't go through 8th grade. It's actually 7th grade for math, but it's 8th grade for English. So it's the full population of them, unless you got left back or didn't take a test or left the school system. So no bias there.
Is there enough transfer across schools to detect the school effect?
It's right here. No.
This is one of the things that was looked at. I mean, George was here too, but we looked at some of the school effects. We touched on some of it, yes.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I don't recall directly the particular numbers we found, but there were clearly school effects. So if you were a high-achieving student in a low-achieving school, you had a much more negative, there was a negative effect to that as you moved through the years. And similarly, low-achieving kids who had the benefit of being in schools that were predominantly high-achieving, there was also some effect there, but there was quite a sharp effect on the negative effect
On the high-achieving kid in the poor school.
We got a separate publication on that. That wasn't in this one, but we've done work on that in the past, and yeah, the peer effects are really big.
And does that account for the fact that kids do not leave schools randomly? I mean that the parents of a high-achieving kid in a low-achieving school some of them are more likely to take their kids out of that school either by leaving the city or going to private school or whatever else they might do, but kids do not change schools completely at random. So,
of course, and
right,
we're following individual kids. I mean, that's the good part about the
but only the ones who
data.
Stay in the system.
Right.
The kids who leave the system are not
the ones we can follow.
Right.
The only ones we can follow.
I understand that. I understand that, but I think there are ways of correcting for that. And you do have not that I know them, but you do have a selection issue there, even if you're following the kids who stay.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's probably less to the extent that the kids are typically transferring within city schools.
Right.
So, and since the city school population at 1.1 million is so big, it takes care of some, but I agree with all of it.
Do you intend to use some of the other information you have or might be able to link to it, like, absences or, other kinds of right-hand side variables, do you know?
We've got them. We have that, we've done work looking at absences, and in particular as one of the important indicators of high school success. It's huge. So you can look at an 8th grader's attendance record and really tell whether they're going to graduate or not.
Yeah, we have a paper underway on that. We think of it as trying to identify some of the indicators of high school success. And it's by the same author. And again, it's a cohort study. We're following a bunch of kids through. It's very important that we pick up where they were in 8th grade. And 8th grade makes a lot of difference. 8th grade is a very good predictor for how a kid is going to turn out in high school.
Did you find gender disparity in math? Because they they usually say the reverse is true.
Yeah, but it wasn't the same across races. Okay, I think just in terms of time constraints, we've got a bunch of stuff coming up, including look at local labor markets. We've got a paper on the changing distribution of federal Title I aid, which is an issue that came up here fairly recently. And the next volume of our Education Indicators Report will be posted shortly. This one looks at resources available to middle school and high school students, like science classes and AP classes. And like the other recent volumes, it's on the web and it's interactive, so it's kind of fun to play with. So that's it.
Any other questions? Maybe the people who came in after we introduced ourselves can do so now.
Sure. Matthew Washington, Manhattan Borough President's Office.
Great. Deborah?
Deborah Golby, Hunter College.
Okay, I think that's it. All right, now, Deborah, that you're here, we can have a robust discussion of the minutes. So we need to approve the minutes from our September meeting? Yeah. So, and which have been distributed, and all those, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
Move.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. So all those in favor? Okay. All right. Great. So now, as ever, we have presentations on some current work of the IBO, and the first one is, as I said, this kind of depressing slide. George?
And I should say I'm a little under the weather, so if I'm not clear, signal to me. What I'm going to be talking about is a quick summary of this is one of our charter mandated reports that we put out in December. It's looking prospectively at what we think is sort of the outlook for the city over the next few years, and highlighting some of the issues and challenges that'll be there. It's beginning to be a little dated at this point. We're a month past when we released it. Some things have changed, and certainly one of the themes that was throughout the paper, throughout the report, was, at that time we didn't know what the final picture would look like on the tax bill, and so there's a lot of this could change, we don't know, We know a little bit more, but there's still an awful lot unknown about the implications of the recent tax bill, and also some other issues that are confronting the city. So, big picture, local economic growth continues, but the pace is definitely slowed. Excuse me. So for now, that leaves the city's fiscal condition fairly stable. The budget remains balanced this year. That's not a surprise. It would be shocking if it wasn't balanced. There is still a gap in OMB's estimate for 2019, the upcoming fiscal year. The mayor will be releasing a preliminary budget for 2019. It's technically scheduled for next week, although we're expecting a move to the 30th. I don't know if that showed up on the calendar yet, but the council's voting today, so presumably they will move the date to the 30th. And that the mayor's preliminary budget will have to show a plan to bring 2019 into balance. The gaps in the outer years, out years are relatively small compared to some historical past, and they're certainly manageable. As I said, there was a theme in our outlook report was that there's greater uncertainty this year. It really stems from three areas. There's what appears to be a pretty significant budget shortfall at the state level, and that will potentially cascades down onto the city. Obviously, the federal tax law changes, and perhaps what will come up even faster than any of the consequences of the federal tax change are federal budget threats that are likely to come up in the next year or two. So, this sort of captures the idea that the economy is slowing. I could give you a lot of other data, but this probably is sufficient. Each bar here is a year. These are calendar years. This is the number of jobs added to the economy in each year. And if you look over here at 2017, you see that we're at about 65,000 jobs added. But as recently as 2014, we had what was probably, this is probably a year we won't see again for a while, but 135,000. And at 65,000, we're just barely above the first year of recovery from the 2008-2009 recession. So this is consistent with our sense that the economy continues to grow. It's healthy to be able to add 65,000 jobs, but it's certainly not growing at the same pace as it was a few years ago. Another indicator that we pay a lot of attention to is wages in the city. Average real wages, they continue to shrink when you measure them adjusted for inflation. They've fallen in 5 of the last 6 years. They're now 10% below the 2007 peak before the prior recession. A lot of that is due to Wall Street wages, particularly in the security subsector. They're down 20% compared to 2007.
If you take out Wall Street, what's the overall number?
It's still going to be negative, but not nearly as negative. I don't have that. We could get you that number, but you know, well, because we see weakness across a number of industries, but obviously not as much as security system. As we've done for the last 2 or 3 years, our forecast assumes a return to positive wage growth. It hasn't happened. You know, we've been wrong the last 2 years, but we're sure we're right this time, and so you know, that's built into our forecast. So if you move from economics to what does that mean in terms of city revenues, we've got, you know, somewhat faster revenue growth than OMB. We're at 6%. They're at 3.9%. So that's a difference right there of 1.2 billion in additional revenue that we think the city generates. It's concentrated in areas that are traditionally differences between our forecast and OMB's forecast, particularly in the real property tax and the income taxes. If you look at 2019, OMB actually has somewhat faster revenue growth than we do, but because we're starting at a higher base from 2018, we're 782 million above them in our revenue forecast for 2019, and it's pretty much the same issues. They have a very low, mortgage reporting tax forecast for 2019, and we're haven't quite figured out why there's such a big difference there. But those are the 3 areas that there's a significant difference.
Is there an interest rate difference in the economic forecast?
Not really. There's an interest rate difference on what OMB assumes they have to pay for debt service, but not in the Just a couple of the highlights from the November plan, which was the mayor's as I said, this will be very shortly out of date, but this is what the latest numbers we have at the moment from OMB. They project a gap for 2019 of 3.2 billion. As I said before, once they produce their preliminary budget, they have to show it in balance. IBO's gap for 2019 is smaller, and that's because, first of all, because we have a surplus in 2018, and OMB does not forecast a surplus in 2018. We assume that gets rolled into 2019, and then our 2019 revenue estimate is higher, and we differ with them on some of the costs of some government operations. All of that rolls together into, instead of a $3.2 billion gap for 2019, we think it's 1.6 billion.
Your prepayment includes general reserve.
It does not include the general reserve. That's still sitting there on the side. So that's yeah. And you did you look ahead? So there's a lot of talk about whether the city has adequate reserves, and I think first of all, you have to distinguish between 2 different types of reserves that the city employs. One is built into their regular budget is first of all, a general reserve, and the city's been putting about $1 billion into that the last few years. In addition, the city has what they call a capital reserve, which was set up 4 or 5 years ago in order to be a backstop in case there were problems with some capital projects. It's never been used. So that's sitting there. Those 2 reserves are sitting there in the budget with no particular operations pointed against them. It's unappropriated money within the budget. And so the 2018, they have 1.4 billion of such reserves. In 2019 through 2021, because they bring the capital reserve down to 250 million, it's a little smaller, but it's still 1.25 billion. All of that is sitting there in the budget, and that, as Preston hinted, that will also be a source of prepayment when they, out of 2018 into 2019 and out of 2019 into the subsequent years, when they need to bring those budgets into balance.
So there's no restrictions on the capital reserve that, for instance, it has to be used on subway maintenance?
Well, the capital reserve is a new item, and they sort of invented it.
Right.
It was I'm not sure. I don't want to speak to their motivation. It was different, you know, because we already had a general reserve.
And they could use it for capital spending and then not do some spending elsewhere?
No,
They could
because
use it
it's
for anything. They could spend it on capital projects if they wanted, but it's an expense budget item.
Yeah.
You know, so I'll speak to their motives. I mean, it's just money. It's just
Yeah.
money.
It's cash.
So you
Well,
can
that I understand, but there might be,
No, there aren't.
No, there aren't
there
any.
might be this kind of restrictions.
No. Then, in addition, there's a fund that the city's been maintaining since the mid-2000s, the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund, which is was created in order to begin accumulating assets that you could use to pay your retiree health benefits in the future. The city has an enormous liability there, and there's very little money against that at the moment. This was intended to be a way of beginning to accumulate resources that you could use for that. And at the moment, that has about $4 billion in it. The city has already several times dipped into that fund as a way of when it needed money for budget relief. So it's beginning to look more like a rainy day fund, although the city officially doesn't have a rainy day fund. And
It always was. But
it was. You can't actually take the whole $4 billion out of there because you have to use it for you have to pay your retiree benefits out of that fund. So in any 1 year, because you have to make those payments, and those payments have to come from that fund, it only leaves about $2.5 billion in potential budget relief if you needed to go there. But it is there. So we look at this as, depends what you're trying to reserve for. But if a budget reserve, the way we think about it, it's to get you through maybe the first 12 months of a severe downturn. It's not to get you through the entire business cycle between, so that when revenues go down, it's unlikely that you would ever have enough money in your budget reserves that would carry you all the way through such a downturn. But if you think about it as what do you need in the first year or so as you're responding, as you're putting in place a pay program or a savings program, as you're thinking about ways you might raise revenues, it's a source for some relief there.
And there's no restrictions on how that retirement health trust fund can be used?
Well, the one requirement is, because the way they set it up, is you have to use it to pay your current, whatever obligations you have for current retiree benefits.
Yes.
But then that frees up city funds to use for other purposes that you want.
So what are do you know what the retiree health benefit liability is estimated to be? $100 billion.
$100 billion?
Yeah, billion.
That's just the
Billion.
unfunded part.
So rounded, the unfunded part is $100 billion. Well, what about pensions, as long as I'm asking?
Pensions, they're closer to funded, but not fully funded.
More than 4%.
Whatever it is, that's understated.
Pensions are protected.
Pensions have there's under the state constitution, there's protection for pensions that is different from those commitments are covered by the state constitution. They're treated as contracts. Don has done a lot of work on ways, exactly how solid how strong those constitutional commitments are. But at least in theory, they're there.
Yeah.
These retiree health benefits are not similarly protected. They're the result of labor contracts, but they're not. They're not nearly as binding. So another way you could deal with that unfunded is you could stop paying those retiree benefits if you wanted to.
That's what I thought.
If you could stand to. Politics. I wasn't planning to spend so much time on that. Anything else on reserves? Okay, so obviously, you know, our fiscal outlook, we think they've got a manageable budget gap, even and if you dip into these, certainly the general reserve and the capital reserve, you're going to have enough. You probably will have enough money to take care of 2019. But there are a fair number of risks on the horizon for the city. We always have risks, but I don't know. It feels like they're sharper this year. The state budget in their, I guess it was their November update, they had an estimate that there's a $4.4 billion gap in the state budget. Now, arguably, since the state has been holding to a 2% spending growth cap for the last 3 or 4 years, I guess even longer, so early in the Cuomo administration. And they say they intend to do it again next year. That would actually bring the deficit down to, the gap down to 1.7 billion, but it's still a big number. The state controller has put out some estimates that the gap for the coming state fiscal year is closer to 7 billion. New York City budget gets about $15 billion a year in state money, most of it education. And depending on how the state responds to this, you know, what steps they take to deal with their seemingly looming budget gap, you know, some of that could easily cascade down onto the city. The state has put out the last few years state budgets that, at least in the initial proposals, have contained some pretty sharp whacks at New York City. There were some Medicaid proposals. There was a CUNY proposal. So, you know, we're concerned about what could happen here.
Why the big difference between what the state controller is estimating and what the governor is estimating? Or is that all
I'm not sure exactly. I don't have that much familiarity with how they, you know, if that's some institutional difference, or is it just they're reading it differently this year?
For the $15 billion, what do you estimate is a portion of that that's really a threat?
You know, probably. I mean, the cuts that they proposed, I think it was 2 years ago, amounted to close to $1 billion. Don't quote me on that, but it was, by the time you added up what they were proposing on CUNY and Medicaid, it was hundreds of millions of dollars, getting pretty close to $1 billion. I should say that, you know, one of the interesting things going on here is the state gap is mostly on the revenue side. It's not that their expenditures are booming. And it's particularly in there are issues around business income taxes, which have fallen year over year, and personal income tax growth, which has continued, but it's continued at a slower pace than recent history. The New York State corporation tax is down 30% this year on a year-over-year basis, and the city corporate tax is down 15%. We don't know why that is, but we're starting some work to try to figure it out. One hypothesis, and this underlying hypothesis, it may have something to do with the state corporate tax reform that they did 2 or 3 years ago. It was intended to be revenue neutral. There were some questions about whether, you know, would it be revenue, or is it revenue neutral every year, or is it revenue neutral over a 10-year period? It may be that you know, some of that gap in some of that revenue shortfall that we see in the business income taxes has to do with the way they tried to implement that reform package. both New York City and New York State overestimated corporate revenues in 2016 and 2017. The state, though, was much worse. It had a much bigger variance than the city. And interestingly, the city almost immediately corrected its revenue forecast for the corporate, but on the state side, they left in more of their growth assumptions, I guess, optimistically thinking it was going to come back. So there's some interesting issues, and we're starting some work on the differences between the trends in the corporate taxes and the forecasting and the issues around the corporate tax reform. Okay, so obviously another big issue that everyone's focused on is what's happened now that we know a little bit more about the federal tax policy changes. There are going to be effects on both the income of residents of the city and corporations operating in the city, and also in some cases direct revenue effects on the city budget. One of the topics that's gotten a whole, and I'm not going to, believe me, I'm not going to go through the whole bill. But we
could have a special meeting.
One of the things that's gotten a lot of attention is the limit that's been put in place on the use of the state and local tax deduction. And I'm going to suggest that it may not be as bad as a lot of people have thought, or at least have hyped. And let me explain why. You have to pay attention to the interaction between the state and local tax deduction and the alternative minimum tax. And also, in the new federal bill, there's a much larger standard deduction. So the alternative minimum tax is a sort of a completely parallel tax to the regular personal income tax at the federal level. And it was intended to capture sort of the use of abusive tax shelters. And it was aimed at tax filers who were reporting almost no income because they were using various sheltering techniques. But one of the things that, for whatever reason, got counted as a potentially abusive shelter was the state and local tax deduction. So that's been there in the AMT for decades, and the way it works in New York City is for households with incomes between about $125,000 and $500,000, very broadly. Many of those people are paying the AMT today, or they were before this bill, and therefore they had lost the state and local tax deduction. They have not. They aren't, quote, losing because of that change. In addition, there are a large number of people below 125 and even below 100,000 that were paying the state and local deduction, and they've lost that. But they are going to get the benefit of a much larger standard deduction. The standard deduction has been increased by about 85 to 90%, depending on the filing status. So the people below about 100,000 probably aren't losing too much due to the loss of the SALT. And the people between about 100 or 125 and 500 aren't losing because they had already lost. The people who lose are households with incomes above 500,000, and it becomes those people for, I'll spare you the technical reason, but they were not captured by the AMT nearly as much as the households below 500,000.
Oh, that makes sense.
And it had to do with the interaction of the rates and the brackets.
They're getting a rate reduction.
Yes, exactly.
Not to worry.
Right. So that group will very likely, see a loss when they calculate their taxes with the state and local tax deduction.
Depending on the source area.
Excuse me?
Depending on the source area.
Yeah. And then, but they may not see, they may actually come out fine, depending on, there are bracket and rate changes that will lower their taxes. There are also changes that have been implemented to lower the tax burden on partners and members of limited liability corporations and other pass-through entities. So they may or may not be okay. But the big point I want to make is that, you know, just because the SALT is being taken away, it may not be as bad as people are thinking. To the extent you do lose it, though, and obviously you're losing it at the one group that potentially is getting hurt are people with a lot of discretion about where they live. They're high income. They could take their business and themselves and move to Florida. Well, New Jersey's not going to help you, but you could move to Florida or other low-tax states. And the reason they're more likely to do that is that it does raise the cost of living in New York City and New York State for those people. It hurts our competitiveness in attracting residents and companies to try to get them to come here. It certainly makes it harder to raise taxes if we need to, and the city and the state have you know, in 2001, after that recession, the city and the state both raised their personal income tax significantly. I think that would be a much harder political sell if you can't point to deductibility.
Although it may have a bigger impact in New York and the suburbs than the city.
Yeah, yeah. It could encourage some residents and firms to leave, but there's a fair amount of evidence that a lot of location decisions are pretty sticky, and I think we have to take that at least with a grain of salt. But so anyway, that's our take on SALT is that it's something to there are a lot of issues there, but it may not be as bad as people think. Another area that is something we're paying attention to is the mortgage interest deduction has been limited. You used to be able to deduct up to $1 million, or the interest on a loan up to $1 million. It's now $750,000. That change in and of itself may not be that consequential because our analysis says there's about 9,300 such sales in the last 12 months in New York City. It's a little less than 10% of the total number of home sales during that period. It has some effect. It will presumably depress prices. You're going to want to get your mortgage down below $750, so it will depress prices somewhat in that tranche. But it's a relatively small number of sales. Where it probably makes a bigger difference is because you're having the larger standard deduction, many people that would be itemizing and using the mortgage interest deduction aren't going to do that because they've got the larger standard deduction, which again, so therefore it makes it harder to go into a purchase and think, oh, I'm getting a mortgage interest deduction, I can afford that much more home. So that will also put potentially some downward pressure on prices. It's worth noting that lower values or lower prices aren't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it can increase it makes home ownership more affordable to more families. It does have an effect on potentially an effect on city revenues because the transfer taxes the revenue from transfer taxes would be affected, the mortgage recording tax would be affected. And eventually, although it takes a very long time for changes to work their way through the property tax system, it would eventually also potentially have a revenue effect on property tax.
George, there's been a lot of chatter, I guess, talk in the nonprofit sector about the potential impact on charitable contributions, and I think most people know that the nonprofit sector is a huge employer in New York City, and that there will be, because of the increase in the standard deduction, there will be a consequential.
Right. It's the same logic as on the mortgage interest. I think that's where the bigger effect will be, more than just on that little slice of people that no longer can deduct.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting avenue of inquiry because I think it's like 1 out of 6 people in the city are employed by nonprofit institutions, if we include hospitals. Big.
Yeah, and I think it should have. You would think it would have some effect on people's behavior as contributors. just very quick, there's another group of people that pretty clearly could be hit by the changes. That's large families. They got rid of the personal exemption for children, for individual children, actually for adults too. And although the standard deduction is bigger and there is a child credit, if you've got families, 5 kids or more, it looks like you could wind up with a tax increase. And there are parts of New York that have, it's not atypical to have a family with 5 or more kids. So, we should note, of course, that there are some provisions that are generally beneficial to all New York City residents, and those include the lower personal income tax rates, the broader standard deduction. They've raised the threshold on the alternative minimum tax. You could argue, or you could question whether, having gotten rid of the state and local tax deduction piece of the AMT, maybe the AMT is back to being more about making sure that people using abusive shelters are still taxed. But they've raised the AMT threshold, so it will diminish, at least to some extent, the efficacy of the AMT for those types of taxpayers. There's also a lower corporate rate, and the pass-through benefits that will should raise profits and dividends. That should have an income effect in the city. There are some specific provisions that seem to benefit real estate developers. It is one of our hometown industries. So the city and state may or may not have some responses on this. First of all, there are some things. What the city would have some things it would like to see happen that would benefit the city, but would probably wind up hurting the state, and so I guess they're unlikely, but I'll just list them. One is to shift to a greater reliance on property tax. Since property tax is deductible against your state income tax return, those are,
But currently you have to federally itemize.
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
So,
and that's what I was going to capture here. That you would have to change the requirement. You'd have to change state law to say you can itemize for state purposes, even if you don't itemize for federal purposes. That would potentially help the city. It's going to hurt the state because the state would lose revenue off of that. So I guess it's not very likely.
The state makes that decision,
So as I said,
this is all going to be great for the accounting industry, which is big in the city.
It is, although the accountants got left out of. It's interesting on the pass-through, right? Where they don't get the benefit of the pass. It's some of our biggest industries: lawyers, doctors, and accountants are left out from the benefit of the lower pass-through rate.
But the same could be said of the income tax, right? You can also make the income tax deductible.
You could. I guess it would. I was thinking
It's actually the bigger burden for most of the
Yeah. But for the state as a whole, I mean, across the whole state, the local income tax. And some things, would benefit the city and state together. Some of these, I suspect they are going to have to take a serious look at trying to do. One is this pass-through, the way the preferential benefit is made available to members of pass-through entities, which are partnerships, proprietorships, limited liability corporations, is they get a deduction on their personal income tax. That deduction, for federal purposes, is not an itemized deduction. It's just an additional deduction between AGI and taxable income. My reading, I'm not a lawyer, but my reading of the way the state tax system works right now is that would probably flow through. You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Okay, I hope you're right. But we, if it does, the city and the state could decouple from that and spare ourselves. That could it could potentially be a significant revenue hit if it does flow through. Similarly, the city and state could decouple on other provisions that are in the business side of the federal changes, they've sped up the rate at which you can depreciate assets, and also in some cases offer full expensing in the first year. In the past, the city has decoupled on this when it's been done, not all the time, but some years. So, I could see them revisiting that. There's probably some issues around the treatment of repatriated income and the base erosion prevention taxes. They have great names. There's the global intangible lightly taxed income, or guilty. And they use the guilty acronym in the law.
They do have a sense of humor.
Yep. And then the base erosion tax is the base erosion anti-abuse tax, or BEAT tax, and they use that. Anyway, those actually potentially bring some federal revenue that maybe we're not supposed to have into, or federal income, foreign income into our tax base that maybe we're not supposed to have. So they may have to do that. And then there's been this idea floating around of could we shift to a payroll tax, and or set up a system where there could be a charitable deduction for your basic income taxes. There are a number of places that are looking at it. I think that would be a real challenge. I think there are a lot of obstacles, both legal, public relations. If you did a payroll tax, you'd have to convince people that their higher payroll tax is offsetting something else that they don't actually get to see. And I think that would be a pretty hard sell.
And you have to, in theory, negotiate that with labor unions.
Right.
Right.
And if you did it on the entirely on the employer side, you're left with the question of what do you do with government and nonprofits? Because how do you work out the crediting there? I think there's also an issue that you almost certainly have to do it as a flat tax, a single rate, so you would lose progressivity, which is, obviously, you'd have to think about exactly how aggressive you're doing it. Are you doing it for the entire income tax base, or is it just the wage portion? If you're doing the entire, if you're doing just the wage portion, then you've left a lot of income, still subject to the
although in New York,
what you're trying to get away from.
The payroll mobility tax funding the MTA.
Yeah.
George, I'm going to ask.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So anyway, I think, and then one final point on this. I don't understand the optimism. To me, it seems, given that Congress has made it very clear they're not in, they wanted to remove the state and local deduction. It was actually a fight to get back a limited piece of it. Why would you assume that they wouldn't come back and just change the law? It would be pretty easy. You could even do it in a way that doesn't touch all payroll taxes. You could say payroll taxes that are funding general government, not payroll taxes that are going to unemployment insurance or Medicare or Social Security. So I think that's, you could work really hard and get this all set up, and they could come back and take it away from you. Finally, just federal budget risks. These may actually come up probably faster than whatever impacts we get from the state or from the federal tax changes. Clearly, the near-term deficits have grown. That's fueled discussion from the Republican leadership, particularly in the House. They want to begin taking a hard look at safety net programs. They've put Medicare and TANF on the table. Some of these, there were previous challenges for Medicaid. The president's budget blueprint for the upcoming fiscal year is due next month. Last year, it had some very significant cuts for New York that we could follow directly down to New York City. Most of those were not implemented, but the OMB guidance that was sent out this year to start the federal budget process again encouraged agencies to seek even more spending cuts than they had proposed last year. So I think that's something we're going to have to worry about. And then, ultimately, there is still this long-term fiscal imbalance. It's a question, those problems look so challenging, it's very hard to understand why we were cutting taxes instead of raising taxes. So just to sum up, we think near term the city's fiscal condition is fairly stable, but these challenges are likely to grow, particularly from the state and the federal side, but it may take a couple of years before we begin to see it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, George. Any other questions? I mean, obviously, we'll revisit this, I think, at every one of our meetings to see where we stand. But thank you. Sobering. So, just to give you a preview, we do try to end by 10. We have to. We would like to have an executive session at the end of the meeting, towards the end of the meeting, to talk about the reappointment process of our director. It doesn't have to be a long executive session, but I hope that people can stay till 10, so we have a quorum. So maybe, I don't know if we can fit in these two presentations. We'll try.
We'll try.
Okay, so Sarah, you're up on Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village.
Yes. So I'm going to be presenting today on a topic that we recently released a fiscal brief on, and that is Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, the housing preservation deal. In particular, we wanted to look at how much affordable housing did the city really preserve out of this affordable
And
housing.
this report has been released.
Yeah,
Yes.
released last week.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I saw some press about it.
So Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village was the single largest affordable housing deal in New York City in decades. And it was a big chunk of the mayor's housing plan in terms of units that he could claim. And so when they signed the affordable housing regulatory agreement for this property, the city claimed to have kept 5,000 apartments affordable for 20 years. And so we wanted to see if we actually got that. So Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village as a development is very large. It is rent stabilized. It consists of over 11,000 apartments in Manhattan's East Village. And so one of the things sort of in the history of this project was originally it was developed by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company opened in 1947, and they owned it through 2006. So a long period of ownership. With booming real estate, in 2006 they put it up for sale, and it was purchased at that point by Tishman Speyer and BlackRock in what was the single largest real estate purchase in New York City history for $5.4 billion. And in this large purchase price, Tishman Speyer had assumed that they could deregulate or remove apartments from rent stabilization and convert them to market rate, and doing that by forcing out long-term tenants with reportedly aggressive tactics. But it turned out that was harder than they had anticipated. Reasons behind that are detailed in the paper. And that, coupled with the recession, Tishman Speyer actually ended up defaulting on their mortgage, and so they handed the entire property over in 2010 to a special servicer, CW Capital, who took ownership. CW Capital held on to it until 2015 when they put it up for sale. It was purchased by Blackstone and Ivanhoe Cambridge. And so in the span of 10 years, there was a lot of changes in ownership, a lot of changes for tenants in terms of people being pushed out, the rent stabilization status. And so sort of piggybacking off this given history of changing ownership and tenant uncertainty, the city saw an opportunity to step in and try and provide some tenant certainty and provide additional tenant protections. So the de Blasio administration provided $220 million in subsidies and also agreed to support the transfer of air rights for the property to other developments. And they did this in exchange for a regulatory agreement that was signed that announced 5,000 apartments were to be preserved as affordable for 20 years. And because of how this deal is structured, which I'm going to cover in a minute, not every apartment receives the same protections for the same amount of time. And so in doing this study, IBO created our own measurement, which is this term, apartment years. And so this is 5,000 apartments over 20 years translates to 100,000 apartment years. So we're trying to get at this time aspect.
That's 5,000 out of 11,000, is that what you said?
Yes.
Now, without all these changes, would
would stabilized apartments become market rate as tenants moved out? Is that the deal?
So as tenants move out, you can increase rents, and if the rents rise above a certain threshold, you then can deregulate them. So
Okay.
yes, the more tenant turnover, the more the process of deregulating can happen.
And in theory, the mayor's deal was to keep some of those apartments that would have become deregulated still in the regulatory pool? That was the theory?
That was the idea.
Okay.
Yep, and we'll get into what exactly that looked like.
Okay.
So it is a complicated agreement, but I'm going to sort of go through the gist of it, and if you want more details, once again, the paper covers that. So a total of 5,000 apartments must be maintained as affordable through 2035, so for a 20-year period. And initially, the tenants receive no additional protections. They remain rent stabilized, and they continue under rent stabilization rules. So when the agreement was signed, they didn't kick the existing people out, but nothing changed. And what's interesting is, under normal circumstances in this property, so when landlords are not aggressively trying to turn over tenancy to deregulate units, we found a very low average turnover rate, and it averaged an annual rate of about 4%. So why a low turnover rate is of interest to us is that when the initial tenants, so the people who were already living there in 2015 when the deal was signed, when they vacate their apartments, the new people coming in become income tested, so those households have to meet income requirements. And those tenants then receive additional rent restrictions beyond rent stabilization. And for these income-tested apartments, of the ones that have turned over and income-tested households come in, 90% of those apartments are to be reserved for a household of middle income, and that's up to $120,000 for a household of two, by the mayor's definition. And 10% of those are reserved for households of low income, and that's around $58,000 in annual income for a household of two. And for these households, their rents are capped at either the lower of the rent stabilization rent level, or what is considered 30% of their income for a middle or low income household. 30% of your income is what's considered affordable for housing costs. So in assessing this project, first I wanted to look at what would happen in the absence of the agreement, because then that gave us a basis to compare what additional benefits we got out of the agreement. So I'm gonna look at the world if the agreement hadn't happened. So here in this orange box, just to walk you through, I have 5,000 apartments on the vertical axis, and I have the 20-year period on the horizontal axis. And the orange box represents the 100,000 apartment years that I was talking about. So each of these blue bars represents the number of rent-stabilized apartments of this 5,000 sort of cohort over 20 years. And so we estimate how they would deregulate over time. We can see that it decreases. And we did this by building a model. First we calculated turnover rates for the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village apartments. And we looked at rent increases. And we looked at apartment improvements that landlords did in an effort to increase rents. And from that, we were able to build a model and ran many simulations, and this over the 20-year period, and we took the average of those results, and that's what made it into our report. So in 2016, all of the apartments are rent stabilized, and we can see that it goes down over the 20-year period, and this comes out to about 1,800 apartments still remain rent stabilized by year 20. And in terms of apartment years, if you add up all of these blue bars together, that represents about 64,000 apartment years. So that's 64% of the total in the orange box would have been rent stabilized in the absence of this agreement. I would like to pause here and make the point that rent stabilization is not necessarily the same as affordable housing. There is a distinction. So affordable housing, we tie, households come in and they are income tested, but also their rents is tied to their income. For rent stabilization, it just sets a limit to what the landlord can charge in rent, but it has no bearing on a household's income.
It's the distinction I'm sure the deputy mayor will appreciate it.
Mark, what did you say?
A distinction I'm sure the deputy mayor appreciated when the report came out.
One of several things they appreciated.
Yeah.
So then we looked at what the world with what we thought would happen over the 20 years with the model with the agreement in place. And this was done with a similar methodology of running a model many, many times. In this case, we had a lower turnover rate now that we've taken away the landlord's incentive to try and deregulate apartments and push people out. And we also assumed that the landlords would not be making major apartment improvements to try and increase rents since it's restricted under the agreement. So the first thing, these blue bars are the same as we saw on the previous graph. These are apartments where the initial tenant is in place and the apartments remain rent stabilized, and they would have been rent stabilized even in the absence of the agreement. So we've seen those. But then,
Sorry, quick question about that. In terms of the model, what was the turnover rate that you estimated for the model?
So absent the agreement, we looked at historical trends, and in the period of aggressive landlord tactics under sort of the Tishman Speyer years, we saw a turnover rate for these types of apartments of around 10.5%. So in the absence of the agreement, we applied the higher turnover rate because there is an incentive to do that. With the agreement in place, we've removed that incentive and we applied a lower turnover rate that we've seen in more recent years of 4%.
Okay. So 10.5 to get the blue bars.
And in doing that decision, that was sort of in the city's favor in that it's the most generous amount that you got out of the agreement, was the decision we made. So the blue bars represent about 2/3 of that total, once again, the 5,000 apartments over 20 years. So the remainder of this box is actually what we get in terms of benefits. But those come in sort of 3 different categories of additional benefits. So the first group are these red apartments, and we can see them increasing over time. Because we've removed the incentive to try and deregulate units very fast, these are apartments where the initial tenant is still in place and their apartments remain in rent stabilization longer. So this is one additional benefit. The next group of apartments of sort of a benefit category are these green bars, and we can see they also grow over time. So these are apartments where the initial tenants have moved out and new tenants moved in, the new tenants being income tested, so we get that benefit. And these apartments also remain in rent stabilization longer. We've lowered the turnover rate. We're no longer doing major improvements that increase rents and help deregulate apartments. And then lastly, to fill out our entire box, we have this small sliver of purple apartments at the top here. And these are apartments where the initial tenants have moved out, and so the new tenants are coming in, are income tested. And these apartments are where the agreement, they would not be covered under rent stabilization, and therefore the agreement kicks in and helps keep their rents below market rate. Now I've mentioned income testing, and I want to talk through how the breakout of income testing works for these apartments. So the blue bars here represent apartments where the initial tenant is in place, and therefore they're not income tested. So the people who already lived there when the agreement was signed, and we found people in Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, they don't leave. Right. They like it. So of the apartments that turn over, and this increases over time as more people move out, there we go, 90% of those, so this red group, are reserved for middle income households, once again around 120,000 for a household of 2, and 10% of the apartments that turn over, so this green slice at the top, are reserved for low income households. So that's around 58,000 for a household of 2.
I have a question about the initial tenants. So, Aunt Muncie lives in Stuyvesant Town, has lived in Stuyvesant Town for a long time. And eventually, as Aunt Muncie ages, her children move back into the apartment.
Yes.
Do they count as the initial tenant?
Yes,
they would.
They would.
Right? They're added to the lease.
If they're added to the lease and they've lived there for 2 years.
I mean, I'm wondering how many upper income inheritors there are that we are protecting in the purple.
You mean the ones that have homes on the East End because of these apartments?
I mean when the kids move back in, because this is a great deal. how many of those are the people we're protecting in the purple? Do you have any sense of that?
So we don't have a sense of children inheriting versus, so our tenancies were identified based on tenant names, so household names, but I can't tell you the relationships among them.
Well,
but the turnover rate is so low.
So the turnover rate is 4%. Do you know the death rate in that?
Good question.
If you knew the death rate, because, I mean, those people, a lot of those people, and, you know, they're lovely people, but they've been living there since 1947. And so not many of them.
When it was available for whites only.
Well, I know that, yes. So those nice people have been, you know, they're dying. They're not all the original tenants. And so I wonder how many folks we are protecting who don't need it.
We're also protecting people who've lived there since the 40s, whose incomes somehow have gone up a whole lot since then.
Right.
And it was never intended, it was always intended to be a middle-income development, and some of those people went from middle to better than middle over the years. Because there's no difference.
I mean, it's the same problem with rent stabilization.
Anywhere. No, I get it.
Stuyvesant's just a big version of it.
Right. Stuyvesant is a bigger version of everything. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to look into this preservation deal, was this sort of interesting component of the initial tenants, the people who are already there, and we've added protections in some form to them. And so we see, you know, the income testing is about it is 30% of the total apartment years only become income tested.
But not till the end, and you're not discounting for futurity here.
So
it's a cumulative number.
No, I understand that. Yes.
They're soldier on.
Yes. And yes, once again, it's because this was such a large housing deal and such a crucial part of the mayor's housing plan that we did want to look into it. So the city took credit for keeping 5,000 apartments below market rate for 20 years. And that implied 100,000 apartment years. But IBO found that the deal in and of itself provided 36,000 apartment years, or 36% of additional benefits to tenants, and only 30,000 apartment years, or 30% of this time period, provided income testing and matched rents to incomes.
So that was for the investment of 220 million.
For 220 million.
And is it your conclusion, therefore, that that money could have been spent more efficiently to preserve affordable housing?
So we don't take opinions.
You have to know what the price is of preserving affordable housing under other programs and scenarios, right? I mean, this sounds like a lot of money, but it actually costs a surprising amount of money everything costs a surprising amount of money in New York City, but to preserve the unit of housing. There's also the question that Matthew just raised about sort of the value of the air rights to the developer. Was that part of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we don't quantify it because it's unknown where they might transfer air rights to.
But that's a value to the
developers. We're not great at value capture. We're great at value giveaway.
All right. So Jennifer, Don, is your question right on this?
No, it's on this issue, but not.
Okay, Jennifer, Don.
I want to say it raises the issue in all the affordable housing deals that there seems to be less benefit going to people with low income.
Yes, is everybody here with Jennifer?
Who struggle most to actually live here.
Yes.
This is not a deal to help the very bottom.
Oh, right.
If a greater proportion of the units had gone off rent stabilization, would the property tax revenue have gone up?
So for reasons to make it more complicated, this property is currently enjoying J51 property tax abatements and exemptions. I'll get into the details of that in the paper, but it is currently not paying much in property taxes.
The point I wanted to make about not correcting for time is that, in fact, it's worse because the apartment years you're providing are way out into the future. And we paid the money now.
We paid the money now, and in year one.
And you're not getting anything out of it until 10 years down the road.
A very small handful of middle-income apartments.
Right.
It's a long-term investment.
Yes, you just have to count it properly.
And Doug, did the mayor's office, did they try to counter this?
Yes, yes. In a variety of ways, from putting on Twitter a photo of senior citizens and that we're saving this lovely family's house, to saying that we were what? Ivory Tower academics, I believe, who don't understand.
Oh, no, that's only
that's a compliment.
That was George's attitude, not necessarily mine, but
Harks back to the Giuliani.
Better than pointy-headed.
Okay, well, yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks,
Okay, so we are getting a little short on time.
Can I take
Arash?
1 minute? Yeah, we're not going to be able to get to Arash.
Yes.
And let me just say that Arash has joined us as our to study tax expenditures, and you may recall that IBO has new responsibilities with the City Council to each year pick one tax expenditure program to evaluate. This finally came to fruition early in 2017, and in conjunction with the council, we picked the first study. The study was chosen carefully because we didn't have a whole lot of time to actually make it happen, since we had to hire someone to do it, and also because we still haven't negotiated access to all of the data we need with EDC, so those negotiations are still continuing. But Arash, just a few weeks ago, completed the study and presented an outline, a summary, if you will, of his findings to the council, the last council finance hearing under Julissa Ferraris Copeland. She actually sees this as part of her legacy to have established that IBO and the council will agree upon a study, and we will go and complete the study and routinely take a hard look at these tax expenditure deals, which, even though they don't require outlays by the city, are extremely costly.
Can you promise us, Ronnie, that at our next meeting we can start with Arash so that we give him a chance to
We
talk
can do
about
that.
it?
Maybe our next study.
We'll be under.
Does the new city council speaker have a position on the IBO?
I have a call into the new council speaker. Probably doesn't have a position on IBO. It may be more important what the finance chair thinks.
Who's the finance chair?
Danny
Drum. Oh, okay.
So we'll see.
Hasn't happened yet. Isn't it today?
I'm here.
Today. Yeah, I should say that it's IBO's dime that this is continuing under, so that may make it attractive no matter what. Yeah.
Well, so I apologize, Arash. I mean, there was just such excitement about the fiscal outlook. We will start with that next time, and so apologies. So we have a task before us to talk about the reappointment of the IBO director. So what I would do is ask all of the staff members to leave, and thank you, George, and thank you, Sarah, for your presentations. So do I hear a motion to adjourn our meeting?
I move we adjourn the meeting.
Second, Deborah. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.